Now, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has decided to reschedule a high-level delegation to Washington, D.C. to discuss Israel's plans for a ground assault on the southern Gazan city of Rafah. Netanyahu earlier withdrew from the talks after the U.S. decided not to veto a United Nations Security Council resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. More than 1 million Gazans are sheltering in Rafah, which is the last remaining urban center not to have been attacked by Israeli ground forces. Israeli airstrikes on the city overnight have raised fears that a ground assault could begin.
The aftermath of an airstrike in Rafah. A now all too familiar scene, rescuers digging bodies out of rubble.
Things were normal. There's been no trouble here. The strikes just come at random.
About 1.5 million people live here after fleeing Israeli operations in the north, from Gaza City to Khan Yunis and finally to Rafah, the end of the line, where food and medicine shortages threaten an imminent famine, as well as disease outbreaks. But it's unclear how long people can stay or how safe they'll be. The marked areas on this map show where Israel has been conducting ground operations in Gaza, with troops coming close to Rafah. But so far, Israel has only conducted airstrikes here without sending in ground troops. Elsewhere, fierce ground fighting continues, with assaults on targets around Gaza City and Khan Yunis ongoing. Israel's allies' patience is growing thin, and both the U.S. and Germany have said that a ground incursion into Rafah would be crossing a red line. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken visited the region last week to deliver that message.
It risks killing more civilians. It risks wreaking greater havoc with the provision of humanitarian assistance. It risks further isolating Israel around the world and jeopardizing its long-term security and standing.
But Israel has been ignoring these calls from its closest allies. It says it will fulfill its goal of destroying Hamas, and that means an invasion of Rafah is necessary, even at the risk of a deeper rift between Israel and the U.S.
We can't defeat Hamas without going into Rafah. I told Secretary Blinken I hope to do that with the support of the United States. But if we need to, we will do it alone.
Israel says it will move civilians from Rafah into humanitarian islands elsewhere in Gaza, but has released no concrete plans.
Let's get more from DW correspondent Tania Krämer in Jerusalem. Good morning, Tania. I do want to talk to you about Rafah, but first, what are the reasons behind Benjamin Netanyahu changing his mind now about sending a security delegation to Washington to discuss a Rafah offensive?
Well, I think we can only guess at this point what made this turnabout from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. I mean, initially, it was meant to be a protest about the UN Security Council resolution that was not vetoed by the United States. On Wednesday, he said after a visit by a Republican senator that he wanted actually to send a message to Hamas. But also, it is discussed here while he was cancelling this visit, his defense minister, Yoav Gallant, was already in Washington, was about to leave to Washington. They had also talks now about Rafah. So it took out a bit the weight of this decision to cancel this high-profile visit. And we're expecting, two of his senior officials of his cabinet, of this government, to travel to Washington sometime soon.
The U.S. declined to veto a UN call for a ceasefire in Gaza. Where does that leave relations between the U.S. and Israel?
Well, I mean, it depends who you ask. Some analysts here see it as a really serious crisis. Others point more to a crisis between the two leaders, that they're not seeing, obviously, eye to eye on some of the issues. Certainly, what Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has also acknowledged that the international pressure has been stepped up. But what analysts here looking at is actually, one is the diplomatic level, obviously, but the other level is the more practical level. Would the United States, would they actually slow down, for example, the delivery of ordnance or weapons? And that doesn't seem to be the case. And of course, also, we've heard from the US, they do support Israel's right to defend itself, but they want to see a different conduct of war, as we heard also in the report. And what they want to talk about in these talks in Washington is the planned ground invasion of Rafah. They want to hear from the Israelis, what are you going to do to protect civilians that are sheltering there? We always talk about sheltering. Of course, there are airstrikes and shellings going on as well in Rafah, but they want to see what are they going to do if a ground invasion happens to bring those people somewhat to some kind of safety.
Crucially, Tania, does this prevent Israel from launching its offensive in Rafah?
Well, I mean, this is something to ask the military. We've heard it time and time again from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that this ground invasion into Rafah is absolutely necessary to basically to win the war. And he said there are still Hamas battalions in the city that need to be destroyed. So I have been talking also to aid workers, to UN officials here. They're expecting this to happen, but we don't know when and in what way it will happen.
We'll leave it there for the time being, but thanks so much for joining us today. DW correspondent Tania Krämer, in Jerusalem. Thanks so much.
Let's bring in military analyst Marina Mirón from King's College London. Marina, in view of the latest political and military developments, do you expect Israel to launch its offensive in Rafah, and if so, when?
Good day. Well, it is very possible that Israel will actually launch its ground operation in Rafah. However, we don't know when it will happen because on the one hand, we have the UN Security Council resolution, which, according to Article 25 of the UN Charter, is binding. Now, the US abstained from the vote. However, the United States said that some of the points of this new resolution it is in agreement with. And the issue here is that there are a lot of civilians, 1.5 million civilians, a humanitarian crisis in Rafah, meaning that Israeli army should be ensuring civilian safety before starting its ground offensive. And the US would then assess this plan in order to protect civilians first before the Israeli armed forces can commence a ground operation. Now, how they will agree on this plan, where the civilians will be moved, can they be moved, where is space in Gaza? We know that it's very difficult right now in terms of safety, in terms of humanitarian aid to civilians. So there is a likelihood that Israel will start the ground offensive in Gaza, in Rafah. However, we don't know when it will do so, given this plan. And of course, it doesn't want to risk losing US support.
Now, Israel says it cannot defeat Hamas without going into Rafah. If it does, can it defeat Hamas there, or is this just a pipe dream?
Well, we have to understand that Israel has the capability, with external help, in terms of its military, to defeat Hamas militarily. The question here is, how long will it take and at what cost? Not just in human lives, but also political cost domestically and political cost internationally. Therefore, yes, everything is possible. How probable it is another question, and what kind of fallout will be there for Netanyahu to pick up in terms of explaining things to the international community, explaining things to his constituent population who want the hostages released. So there is a divide in the population. One part wants the hostages released more than the destruction of Hamas. And so all these questions need to be answered. And of course, what happens in Gaza after Hamas is defeated? Is it livable? Who is going to reconstruct it?
Now, what are the military challenges in a ground operation, specifically in Rafah right now?
Well, given the fact that it's so packed with civilians, as I said, 1.5 million, and it's already suffering from a humanitarian crisis, allegedly a lot of Hamas fighters would be hiding amongst the population. So the IDF would need to enter another phase of urban warfare, which is difficult because the enemy doesn't wear insignia. they can be using population as their shields. So it's very difficult to distinguish the adversary from the population. So there is a risk, an increased risk of collateral damage. And it's a very slow operation because you have to have good intelligence, and you're still facing a multi-dimensional threat, given the fact that there are still tunnels. So you will have to go literally from building to building. So it will be very slow, but very painful, also for the morale of the soldiers conducting it. And of course, for the international audience seeing, because there will be collateral damage. The question is, how high will this collateral damage be? So conducting that operation while there are so many civilians is, of course, difficult. But how do you filter out the civilians and just leave Hamas in Rafah? So is it even possible? So that's another dilemma that the Israeli military will be facing if they are to conduct a ground operation before ensuring safety of at least a portion of civilians who are now in Rafah.
The military analyst, Marina Mirón, there, King's College London. Thank you very much, Marina.
Thank you for having me.